Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
So unlike a lot of procurement professionals who have come in from, say, finance and, just sort of landed up in commercials, I landed in procurement in a very, you might say, convoluted way. I'm an engineer and an MBA by education, and typically you don't see MBAs ending up as buyers. But there was a very interesting opportunity, I think, in the third or fourth year of my career, where Unilever was in the process of setting up a, a value chain, a team to understand the value chain of materials that we are buying. And that was that was a really cool opportunity. It's right at the intersection set of maths and organic chemistry and physics and, of course, finance as well. So, this team was supposed to develop should cost models and really understand what are the feedstocks, what are the ratios, the conversion costs, and so on of all these items that we are buying. And that appealed to me, and that's how I got into procurement. But since then, I have done the more traditional roles. In my previous role, I was the buyer of chocolate and confection for Ben& Jerry's and Magnum, which is a really, really cool role again. And I don't know many people who could say that, that I've bought the soul and heart of the ice cream for Ben& Jerry's. And then even within this role that I'm doing at the moment, which is a standard sort of category procurement role, what you might call as business partnering in different companies. That's another interesting aspect, right, of the business, where you are then helping to land innovations and savings and talking the language of gross margin. So journey started at a different space, but sort of more in the traditional procurement domain right now.
And within that current role, this is really just for context for listeners, what are you overseeing? Kind of which business units or categories are in your purview today?
Right. So I work within the beauty and well-being business unit, or we call it BT, Business Group, for Unilever. But my focus is all on North America.
Yeah.
And then if I talk in terms of brands, I think it'll be easier to sort of associate. So if you look at in the skin space, for instance, it's all Vaseline, and the hair care space, it's brands like Tresemme, Dove, Axe, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Right. And then I look at all the innovations that are landing for these brands, as well as savings projects and gross margin improvement exercises and so on.
So really, it's a role that encompasses the entire category, like you said, from an innovation perspective down to a cost management perspective. But you're really taking a longer term view of how you can help the business kind of leverage the supply market to either bring innovations to market more quickly, or make sure that you're as cost competitive as you possibly can be. And everything.
That's absolutely it. And I'm purposely using the word business because we are lockstep in with business. Procurement within Unilever is is an entity that's extremely closely associated and impacts the P&L of not just beauty and well-being, but any other business unit that we work with. So it's a really exciting space, because you're directly working with people who are making the day-to-day decisions, as well as long-term decisions on where the category needs to grow and move into.
And how, I know that Unilever is an organization that has a really strong reputation in terms of its procurement capabilities. How would you describe the relationship that you see between procurement and the business?
It's a very positive relationship. And, I keep hearing about, and I don't want to necessarily start off on negative, but just to sort of draw the journey between where some companies may be versus where we are. We hear about procurement needing to prove themselves, right, in certain firms and so on. That's not been the case for us, at least since I've joined the business. And I think it's because, within a culture, it's sort of ingrained that there is this bunch of people, these bunch of professionals who are responsible for 50, 60% of your P&L. We've been through COVID, so there's a lot of institutional knowledge around and appreciation around how procurement has sort of, helped the business in various ways, not just service, but even, inflation,
Hmm.
mitigating inflation. That was a big thing immediately after COVID. And I think that appreciation has come across, in the form of several new opportunities where we are then able to sort of go to the business and talk in very strategic terms about what we want to do with the strategy for our raw materials in line with what they are planning to do. So we don't
Hmm.
necessarily always want to make changes to a supply chain which would impact the end consumer or the customer, but where are we then able to invest the right funds, into doing our business, into doing a procurement part of the business differently? And that might mean requiring funds for vertical integration projects. It might mean asking brand and R&D support to break monopolies, for instance, on suppliers.
Hmm.
And I feel that there is just so much positivity if if one can craft a solid narrative around what we want to do for the business or what the problem is at the moment, and then ask for their help and go down with them on this journey. And the solution might not be, obviously it'll be a technical solution in most cases. Business doesn't need to know all the technicalities. We need
Yeah.
to sort of water it down into a message that's very clear, but then that helps, gets immense support for what we are doing.
Yeah, some of the things you talked about, I remember when I was on the automotive side, um,
Mhm.
addressing supplier monopolies was one of the most fun things that I
Right.
think, certainly that I did as a practitioner, because there's just so much, there's a lot of business acumen that's involved. There's a lot of change management that's involved. It's a long-term kind of, you have to build long-term plans to be able to do that. It's not something you can do overnight. It's not something that you can do
Right.
with a single negotiation. But then, you look 3 years down the line, and you're able to do that and bring more competitive supply bases. There's a lot of achievement, a sense of achievement, I think, and a lot of value that procurement can then bring to open up different sources of supply that may not have existed before, and really develop new sources of supply as well.
No, absolutely, Philip. This sort of mirrors so well with what we have seen with brands like Ben and Jerry's and Magnum, right? These are very ethos-driven brands, and if you speak with a business head for Ben and Jerry's, they would know suppliers who have been with them for the last 50, 80 years. And how do you then sort of go back and do this in a positive way, do a alternate supplier approval in a positive
Mhm.
way, when you want to make sure that the business isn't perceiving this as being disloyal to their suppliers, and uh, because they're also innovating with them constantly. And I think this is where that adage of never lose a good crisis, or
Mhm.
never lose that opportunity which a good crisis gives you, can really help one. And we went through the same thing during COVID, and we had these amazing products coming in from a base of suppliers who were, who had been working with us for a long time. And but we were going into the pandemic with almost 100% single sourced supply base on the
Yeah.
confection and chocolate side. And then it was about the right messaging, right, to the business, that look, this is not about being disloyal. This is about balancing what we're trying to do, the good that we're trying to do with the
Mhm.
suppliers, with backup plans.
So I know we've talked about how important relationships are in business partnering is at
Right.
Unilever with procurement and the business. Um, what kind of observations do you see about the teams and the leaders at Unilever that have the most successful relationships with procurement? How are they approaching procurement?
I think they approach procurement as an ally.
Yeah.
And, with the cost of repeating myself, I would say, if you have 60% of your direct and indirect P&L being managed by a bunch of professionals, it behooves you to stay very close to procurement. And that's the way it happens. So there are several instances where this conversation or connect could take place. I think it's still on us as procurement professionals to invest the right amount of time in building these relationships and building the narrative. And there are more than enough opportunities, right? Every time there is a crisis, in fact, business demands this now. Business wants to know what's going to be the impact of possible tariffs that would come in on Jan 20th or whenever. And we are doing detailed simulations for the same, like every other company is. And that's a great opportunity to not just show them the impact, but then what would our take be, and what steps 1, 2, 3 would be
Mhm.
if this were to happen, right? And
While you've talked about the strength of the relationship between procurement and the business. As a
right.
procurement leader, how do you think about ensuring that when you have the opportunity to show up, that you're putting procurement's best foot forward, and that you're focusing on ways that demonstrate the value that procurement can drive to stakeholders? Because I'm sure that amongst the kind of partnership, the culture of partnering, there are still skeptical stakeholders that you have to sell on the value of working more closely with procurement.
Right. Yeah, right. That's a great question. And I think it's a question we ask ourselves as well all the
Mhm.
time. Not necessarily wait for the business to ask us, right? But you always want to know, for instance, are you buying better than your competition? Are you
Yeah.
able to add value? And this can be done in several ways. The team that I referred to right at the beginning used to do very detailed competitive analysis using publicly available data of how well are we buying, or what kind of discounts are we getting in, what are suppliers' flows looking like. Then there is always opportunity to learn from experts in the space, not necessarily within Unilever, who may understand deeply a certain value chain, for instance, and we heavily leverage those
Yeah.
to understand where is the industry going, where are the margins, what is the price and cost at every stage. And I think 80% of the job is about finding what the problem is, and then once you see that there is a very clear pot of gold, if you were to go down that route, then it's almost easy to convince people with the numbers that
Yeah.
this is where we should be the next 3 to 5 years. And so that's a constant process. And
Yeah.
I wish I could say with certainty that we are buying the best, but I think we can make guesses or guess estimates, and that is what we project to the business, along with necessary caveats, of course.
And so it's a very data heavy kind of process. You're using information to
Yes.
tell the story, but ensuring that you have the ability to influence with, as opposed to just presenting data as it is. Do you find that you have backwards and forwards on the? Because I felt this, when I was a practitioner, I could never fully
Right.
trust the data that I had, and I think that this is a little while ago. So a lot of organizations have invested a lot in good data, and so there's a lot more
Right.
trust in the data when you present it.
Right.
But do you find you have backwards and forwards with in validating, verifying, and questioning the data as you then present it to your business?
And I think it gets better with time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've been doing it for 5 or 8 years, then you sort of sense when a data source is reliable was, and if a data point is making sense or not, or if it's a complete outlier, and needs to be sort of scrubbed and so on. But there are other ways of validating as well, and that's just by staying close to the suppliers and having a very open sort of strategic, open. Am I still there? Philip, did I lose you again for a few seconds?
You just slowed down there for a second.
Yeah, yeah. Let me go again. I think there was a spiral that came up on my screen which suggested there was, but
Yeah,
hopefully you can edit that part.
let me just make a note of the time. It's been an issue, honestly, all the way through the interview. I'm not sure if the Wi-Fi is great on your side, or whether there's something from an internet perspective that's
Right,
getting in the way.
right.
Um,
But again, yeah, we were talking about data. So
yeah,
the more data you use, not shying away from data. Shying away from data is not the answer, right? So you need to sort of continuously build on built on sort of assessing and seeing which data source works out. I think we've got there on a fair bit of commodities now.
In terms of how procurement is structured, do you have kind of a central data team or a center of excellence that helps provide you with information, or is it from a category lead perspective, you're kind of owning the data relative to your category and finding the right data so you can tell the story?
So there is value in consolidating it because, for instance, uh, the way our teams are structured, there is a clear sort of portfolio team, which would then portfolio commercial buying team, which would then sort of business partner with this data team. And I've played both roles in my sort of previous stints on the data side as well as the commercial side, wherein on one hand you are sort of creating that data, but equally on the other hand you have to put that data to use. So
Yeah.
the best person to put that data to use is the buyer who's front ending these discussions,
Right.
So there's a pretty close connect between what we call, this, well, we have a different name for it, but what you mentioned as the center of excellence, along with and the commercial sort of buying teams. Okay.
Now, we talked about business partnering and building trust kind of with the business, but I also just want to ask a couple of questions before we wrap up about the risk side of the equation. You talked a little bit about how relationships were, a lot of relationships were formed or built on during COVID with everything that you had to do in terms of maintaining supply during COVID. But, as you think about the role of procurement at Unilever as it's baked into the process, what role do you play in managing and mitigating risk related to supply?
I think our role starts right at the beginning of introduction of new products. So of course there is a whole lot of activity going around service and quality at any point of time. But if we really sort of take a step back to see when does risk get introduced into the system, most of risk comes in when there's a regulation change or there is a new innovation happening. And I'm of the firm belief that that's the point of time when you need to go out and sort of have that sometimes difficult conversation with the brand teams, the R&D teams, and say, um, is there a better option than setting up a supply chain which could give us what we want, but is extremely convoluted and extremely fragile? And can we have, for instance, a little more time to set up something that is local? Can we start with lesser variations of a product and do a 1+1 rather than start off with a whole bunch of colors? That's an interesting conversation I'm having with one of our brand teams right now. And then also use that as a way to sort of push towards where should your sourcing come from, right? Because you've got these larger risks coming up, say on tariff, which may not be very visible to a non-procurement professional, at least not from the sense of the way we are sort of getting in deeply at a supplier level and having supplier level conversations. And then what does that mean for a supply chain which is 3 to 5 years ready? And then does that mean we go to a different country or a different location and sort of bake those things in with innovations? So I like to think of risk as something that can be impacted, even if it's a risk that comes up on you suddenly. Well, there's not much you can do about it. You can probably just air freight and buy a spot. But then a lot of risks are genuinely ones that can be mitigated if someone has had the courage to have the right conversation at the right point of time.
Yeah, and mitigation designed in to at the beginning as much. I mean, that's the ideal state, which is, again, I speak from my experience in the automotive space.
Right.
Oftentimes you get the opportunity to do that, and certainly for me, oftentimes I didn't. And you're making decisions at the beginning when you're doing new product development that can impact the product for years to come. It's not easy oftentimes to switch suppliers.
Absolutely.
Or there's a lot of change management that comes with switching suppliers or switching locations. And so the further upfront you can get in that process during product development, the more impact that you can have as procurement in helping to think about all the different risk factors.
Absolutely. And I want to add one point, which is at least helped me personally, and what I see reflected in a lot of leaders within Unilever is the sense of ownership with the business. This is not
Mhm.
a brand problem or a R&D problem, and we cannot play a victim at the end of 3 years saying, "Guys, I told you so," and
Yeah,
this has gone down exactly the way.
yeah.
No,
You should have
that's
listened to us.
yeah, no, that doesn't help.
Now, when you think about risk management, one of the things that we say, and I've done risk management training as well for large organizations, is that you can't manage all risks at all times. It's you've got to figure out a way to focus on the risks that you think might have most impact. How do you think about specific risk factors that you're looking to help mitigate against? Are there specific factors? Is it dependent upon the product? And there's the certain situations of each thing that you're buying. I'd love to know just how you kind of focus down from all this risk exists out there to these are the 2 or 3 risks that we really need to be aware of in this particular product that we're buying.
Right. And no, that's a great question. I'm going to try to sort of marry this with an innovation process that we follow within Unilever, right? Where we do a pretty detailed innovation risk assessment. And that's not just related to procurement, but everything else related to factories and, organizations and so on. And so this forms a part of that exercise. I think we have found benefit in thinking about risks in a 2 by 2 matrix. Is it visible in advance, or is it something just simply going to strike us when we don't know when? And
Mhm.
can it be mitigated in the short term or the long term? So, and just to sort of build a couple of examples to bring this closer to reality, uh, you know, a disruption with a supplier might not be visible, and it may not be able to mitigate in the short term. Um, Whereas something which is expected, like the annual hurricane season,
Yeah,
we know it's coming, right? And
yeah.
then we sort of take those required steps to mitigate that. Um, if there is uh, an instance of a regulatory change that's coming up, that is something that we can action. So I think we're always on the lookout for us. We also have tools that trawl a lot of news sites to see what could be next problem for us, if you want to
Mhm.
call it that. We are members of several associations. It's the job of the portfolio manager, the commercial manager, to stay close to what's happening on ground and sort of then start to feed back into the larger cross-functional team, including R&D, on what are the changes that are going to happen. And one thing I will say for Unilever, we are extremely good at project planning. So there
Yeah.
are detailed networks, and that's not necessarily a task that I like, or even a lot of people
Mhm.
in procurement like. But our planning teams, for instance, do a great job of what that means from an artwork change or a label change. When does the formulation need to change, and those sort of steps that need to flow up right to the time when there's a shelf reset. Uh, I think that was a pretty long answer to your question, but if I were to boil it down to a sentence, I would say keep looking out for us. We keep
Mhm.
looking out for them, and very quickly doing an assessment if this is something that's going to blow up, this is something that's going to, is this something that we can live with and manage via an inventory model, a pretty quick tactical solution, for instance, or include, increasing the days of cover, or do we really have to put you know, a team around that and come back with monthly meetings and so on.
Right. My final question before we wrap up is kind of
Yeah.
the balancing the two. We talked about innovation, we've talked about risk. Oftentimes market cycles for a lot of procurement professionals, they get stuck in this a bit of a wheel of that. As market conditions or business conditions change, you focus on one versus the other. Cost savings in this part of the cycle, innovation in another part, risk in another part, and it kind of goes round and around. And it's really hard to balance it. And if you don't be able to balance it, it can have a lot of negative impact on your supplier relationships. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of balance the cycles with the need to make sure that you're still kind of focusing on innovation, risk, the spend management, all at the same time, as opposed to going from one to the other to another and being a little bit inconsistent. I know that's something that a lot of procurement folks struggle with.
And I would almost turn this back on its head and say that I don't think these are two different aspects. And I say this because we are always going to be looking out for savings. That's part of the bread and butter, or the core of a procurement professional shop, right? We are always going to be measured on that. But innovation is also something that's going to happen. The mandate of a brand team is to renovate their brands every 2 to 3 years. It's the standard for any consumer goods company. So that's also set in stone, and that's going to happen. Now, would the innovation be something that is going to be based off, say, in the future on a low cost chassis, and hence are we trying to capture a section of the market at a lower price point, or are we moving towards premiumization? I think it also needs to come from the business. And I'm a true believer in procurement trying to solve the single largest problem for the company, right? And if the problem is gross margin, it's not necessary that we focus only on savings. It could also be solved via pricing.
Yeah.
But we have a role to play in pricing as well, because our retailers in the US are not just going to accept a price hike out of nowhere. So procurement partners with our brand and CD teams, what we call customer development within Unilever, to sort of build these detailed narratives around commodities, how are they moving, and in an effort to convince the retailers that what we're saying is right. And there might be a lot of inflation which we have not really priced for, and then that's a completely different angle. So yeah, I don't think they're necessarily in two different spaces. I think we have a role to play in both.
And really, just to pick one thing out of that, is a continued focus on what the business needs, the business's challenge, and it's not necessarily what are some arbitrary procurement metrics that we want to follow, but what does each business unit have challenges with or opportunities with, and those may differ from business to business, from product line to product line, and how is procurement best placed to help either solve that problem or take advantage of that opportunity.
100%. And there is so much mileage and so much more that we can get done if we speak the business language. Rather than talking in dollars per metric ton, let's talk the language of pips and gross margin, and that would really open quite a few doors for us.
Well, Ashish, I know it's about time to wrap up, so I want to thank you so much for joining me on the Art of Procurement today and for sharing some of your experiences at Unilever when it comes to building trust, when it comes to managing risk, driving innovation, and really helping the business do all those things at the same time. So if anyone's listening and would like to connect with Ashish, what we'll do is we'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile on the show notes page for today's episode. Anybody can find those just going to artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. So one last time, Ashish, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.